All right, everybody, welcome back to Philosophy for the People. I'm going to talk natural theology today, and I want to give you a summary of some of the different approaches, philosophical approaches to God. We offered a taxonomy of responses to the problem of evil last week or the week before, or something like that, and people seem to enjoy that. They seem to enjoy the general overview. What's the landscape? What's the territory look like? That's what I'm going to do here. This will be a relatively short episode. My job is just to say, hey, here's some ways that philosophers have tried to think about God, think about the existence of God or the nature of God or both, and try to just give you the very quick executive summary of what that approach is, and also some challenges to think about. What are some advantages of this approach and what are some challenges of this approach? And I want you guys to continue this conversation in the comments. If you find an approach here that you resonate with and I give a challenge to it, doesn't mean that I think the challenges are successful, but it also doesn't mean that I think any of these approaches are successful either. I'm just trying to be a reporter here, just a good, honest reporter over at Philosophy for the People. So let's get into it. I got a little document today. We like documents, don't we? So many documents. And this will serve as an outline to our discussion, and I will build this out and fill it in a little bit, and I'll put a blog post over at Substack. And what I'll do is with this document, this very special document, there it is, I will link previous conversations that I've had with people on these approaches, because I have probably had at least one in-depth conversation with a relevant expert, somebody who's published, who has published, an argument that could fall under one of these approaches. I've definitely had a conversation with, probably every single one of these approaches with somebody who knows something about it. And I'll try to link those over at the Substack so you can go deeper. If one of these approaches intrigues you and you want to go deeper, I'll link a conversation for you to do that. Okay, without getting wasting too much time, let's get started. So what is natural theology, first off? Well, very quickly, theology is really the science of God. Its subject matter is God. And natural theology is where we're just using the power of natural reason to see what we can discover about God, God's existence, God's nature, or both. It's different from revealed theology because we are not taking for granted that God has revealed something to us. It's just from the armchair, doing philosophy, what can we know about God? That's what natural theology is all about. It's an extremely rich tradition, and it's extremely vibrant today. There's still tons of debate and conversation and publications within the realm of natural theology. So that's what we're up to. We're just kind of giving a survey of some of the different arguments within natural theology for the existence of God. Okay, so I'll try and for those who are just listening and not watching, if you head over to the YouTube channel, you will see the document is now on the screen. The document we've all been waiting for. And I'm just going to try and zoom in a little bit so it's a little bit easier, mostly for me to read. Doesn't matter how big my glasses get. It's always hard. Okay, so let's start with the Leibnizian approach. Obviously, this is referring to Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz. And if you remember, Dr. Jim and I did a 3-part series on Leibniz's On the Ultimate Origination of Things. So that would obviously be the place to start on this podcast if you want to go deeper into the Leibnizian approach. But here's the executive summary. So for the Leibnizian approach, what the cosmological reasoner is up to is they generally start with some, broad explanatory principle, which is often known as the principle of sufficient reason. And what they will do is we'll try and formulate that principle in such a way that it will cover all sort of natural or contingent facts, such that the application of that principle will get you to at least one necessary or supernatural fact, right? So the PSR, there are many different formulations of it, but it might say that there's a causal explanation for every contingent or natural fact. And then what will happen there is the proponent of the Leibnizian approach will sort of apply that principle to the entire plurality of all contingent or natural facts, again, to get really that profound category shift, to say, hey, to get a complete adequate explanation of why there's anything of the type contingent or anything of the type natural at all, we need at least one non-contingent, necessary, or supernatural fact, right? And then from there, It is true that you got to kind of traverse what's called the gap, right? So in a lot of the contemporary literature, there's this what's called the gap problem, right? And that's like it goes like this. Okay, suppose we give you some that we need some necessary being, right? Well, why should we think that that necessary being is God? So that's kind of like phase 2 or stage 2 of cosmological reasoning. Now there are certain versions that seem like they could bypass the gap problem altogether. If you're just looking at natural facts and you go to a supernatural fact, and a supernatural fact is just really qualitatively unbounded entity, pretty quick to get to God from there. If you're just getting to a necessary fact, okay, maybe you have to do some more conceptual work, but that's what people do in the literature, right? They try to shine the light of reason on what the nature of a necessary being would be, and they argue that it's just what's going to flow out of that or what's going to follow from that of a truly necessary and unconditionally necessary being will be something with the traditional divine attributes, right? Okay, so what are some of the advantages of the Leibnizian approach? Well, a lot of people find the principle of sufficient reason very appealing. Some people argue that it's self-evident, that it's a bedrock principle of reason, that you need it to make sense of uh, inference to the best explanation, that if you try to deny PSR, you're going to wind up in some sort of catastrophically skeptical scenario. So Alexander Proust, he's a major contemporary proponent of this Leibnizian approach. He not only offers a cumulative case for the PSR, but he also defends PSR by saying if you try to deny it, since it's such a bedrock principle, you really take down so many things with it that almost nobody wants to take down. Minimally, you seem to wind up in a pretty horrific empirical skepticism, something like that. Him and Rob Coons have a fairly recent article where they think that if you don't have a PSR that's strong enough to cover all natural facts, such that you have to affirm at least one supernatural fact, you wind up with empirical skepticism. So yeah, a lot of people might think PSR is just true, really strong, and if that's the case, then it seems to be tied, bound up with the existence of God. You give me PSR, we'll get you to God, right? If you deny PSR, then you're gonna then the ship ain't gonna sail, right? And in fact, maybe that's a disadvantage of this approach. And there are skeptics. Jim mentioned that Bill Rose said to him one time that, yeah, if you think PSR is true, you should be a theist, but I guess he wasn't convinced of PSR, so he didn't follow the reasoning through, right? There's other challenges that are often presented for the Leibnizian approach. One is contrastive explanations. Do we lose contrastive explanations? Can we get contrastive explanations? By that, we mean why this rather than that type of explanation. So one thing that cosmological reasoners often propose is, hey, so it seems like to make sense of why there is any contingent reality or collection of contingent things at all, we need at least one necessary thing. But how do we get the contingent from the necessary, right? That's kind of a fascinating puzzle, isn't it? And a very traditional solution is that it's because of God's free choice, that God is a necessary being who freely decided to create the world. He need not have created it, so that helps to account for its contingency. But then people want to know, well, why did God create this world rather than that world, or no world instead? Can we get an explanation in that sense, a full, complete explanation? Some people say yes, other people say no. Some people think that if you say no, this is a big problem, that you still have brute facts. So, you're not really given a fully adequate explanation. I'm not going to get into that now. I have covered that in this podcast before, actually quite a number of times. I'll just say this is a common challenge that's brought against the Leibnizian approach. And there's also concerns of plural quantification. We're talking about plurals. We're talking about some things taken collectively. We're not saying that they form into a composite whole, and that if we take some collection of things, all contingent things, is it legitimate to say that there's something that jointly causes all of those? There's some people who have concerns about that. Again, I'm not going to get into that now. I'm just saying these are some of the challenges, and I'd like to hear your thoughts of whether you think they're serious and substantial challenges or whether you think they can be overcome. All right. Moving on now, let me pull the document back up on my end so we can scroll down. Looks like Anselm is up next, the Anselmian approach, or the perfect being approach. So what is this all about? Well, this is the approach where it has been suggested that we can really deduce God's existence from the very idea of God as that which nothing greater could be thought. And the horribly inadequate executive summary is that if God is that which nothing greater can be thought, then clearly a God that exists both in reality and not just in thought is greater than the God that exists just in thought. And so yeah, it must be the case that God exists in reality, not just in thought, right? There's that again, there's so many more important nuances to that I'm leaving out. I always feel kind of embarrassed to even give such short summaries of things, knowing I'm leaving something out. All I'll say is go listen to if you want the kind of, I think, most robust version of Anselm's argument that I've encountered, see my recent conversation with Daniel Dr. Vecchio. He actually thinks that Anselm's argument is sound, and he presents it in I thought a really cool, fascinating way. So go check that one out. That was probably in the last month or two I had that chat. Anyway, the advantage of the Anselmian approach is clearly that there might be a path to affirming God's existence a priori. So that's neat. That's slick. The disadvantage is just your classic criticism, and this was a criticism Aquinas made too. It seems like aren't we moving just illegitimately from the realm of thought to the realm of reality? So that has been a perennial, persistent criticism of this argument, and this argument is still debated heavily to this very day. Now, let me also say, when it comes to the Anselmian approach, the ontological argument, there are, of course, there's variations of all these arguments. So now, there's all these modal variations, modal ontological arguments. I'm not going into all of that now. Same thing with the Leibnizian argument. There's many different formulations. There's many different variations. There's just a lot out there on this. So I'm just trying to give you the the briefest summary and introduction that I can. But yeah, Anselm's argument, however, and I'm with Dr. Vecchio on this. He does not think it is a modal argument. So even though there are modal ontological arguments, Dr. Vecchio does not think that Anselm's counts as one of those. His is just his own. It's just Anselm's argument, right? Okay, let's move to the Thomistic approach. Obviously, one that we've discussed many times on this podcast. By the way, I might as well just mention where you can dive a little bit deeper into some of these approaches on this show. So for the Leibnizian approach, I've talked with Rob Koons about that. Rob Koons is a defender of this along with Alexander Pruss. So just look up my chats with Rob Koons if you want a flavor of that. The Anselmian approach I've talked with Dr. Daniel Vecchio about. The Thomistic approach, obviously, I've talked with Dr. Gavin Kerr about many times. I've also presented it myself numerous times. But what is Thomas up to? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas offers many different arguments for God, but as many Thomists will argue, including Gavin Kerr, the most fundamental approach of Thomas is found in his De Gente et Essentia, and Thomas is going to argue that certain things, contingent things really, are metaphysical composites of an essence element and an existence element, and that these elements are really internally distinct, such as the essence or whatness of something does not guarantee the existence or isness of something. And then from there, Aquinas has his own causal principle, and that causal principle is something like this, that whatever is not explained or accounted for in virtue of a thing's intrinsic principle, its nature, right, must be explained by some extrinsic principle or external cause, right? And then the idea is that, okay, if a thing's essence can't account for or explain its existence, then we have to look beyond that thing, right, to explain why that thing exists, and not something else or nothing instead, right? So yeah, what are some of the advantages of the Thomistic approach? Well, I should mention one more thing about the Thomistic approach. Thomas, of course, makes an important distinction between accidentally ordered and essentially ordered causal series. And he's going to say only one type of causal series, the essentially ordered or per se causal series, is necessarily terminating. That if we're talking about an essentially ordered causal series, it's just going to be a case that there has to be a primary member, a primary cause within that series. Why? Because the causal property that we've located, we're trying to get an explanation for, is had sort of derivatively by members of that series, and so we have to get back to something that has that that property inherently. So in the case of existence, if it's the case that a thing has existence not inherently, not in virtue of what it is, it sort of participates in existence or is borrowing existence, if you will, or is having existence imparted into it. Aquinas is going to argue that you have to get back to something that just sort of has existence in a robust, built-in way. And ultimately for Aquinas, that's going to be something that is just subsistent existence itself, something whose essence just is its existence, right? And that will for Aquinas be the supreme being. And of course, he traverses the so-called gap by arguing that anything that is pure existence is pure actuality, and anything that's pure actuality is just going to come fully loaded with the traditional suite of divine attributes, right? From of strong classical theism of immutability, omnipotence, omniscience, absolute perfection, perfectly good, all that sort of stuff. And you can go to Aquinas for the long, detailed account of all that. All right, so advantages of the Thomistic approach. I think it has a number of advantages. I think it offers some very unique and interesting resources for dealing with infinite regress issues. That's where the notion of Aquinas's per aliud principle comes in, and his distinction between essentially ordered and accidentally ordered causal series. I think there's definite advantages there. Also, there's sometimes concerns of the composition fallacy going on in cosmological reasoning. And I think that Aquinas's approach can sidestep those because you don't have to think about the universe as a whole, for example, right? So the composition fallacy, if people are familiar, well, just because every one thing in the universe has a cause doesn't mean that the universe in total has a cause, right? Why think that what's true of the parts is necessarily true of the whole? Now, there's a lot of, so that's a challenge to a lot of cosmological reasoning. There's a lot of responses to that. It's okay, well, sometimes what's true of the parts is true of the whole. Think of color properties, right? If every brick in the wall is red, then the entire wall is red. That seems right. Whereas, of course, it's not the case in all situations, right? Just because every part of an animal of a certain size is light doesn't mean the animal as a whole is light, right? So sometimes the response to composition fallacy is trying to argue that, well, if every part of the universe, if you want to speak that way, is dependent things don't stack up into anything that's less dependent or independent. Put all that aside, I think one of the advantages of the Thomistic approach is you can just not worry about that at all, because the Thomistic approach can start just from one thing. Say, this rabbit. Why does this contingent rabbit that is a metaphysical composite exist here and there? And for Aquinas, he thinks you can drive just from that rabbit to the existence of the supreme being, whose essence just is his existence. And then you can follow back from there after Aquinas makes his arguments that there can only be one thing whose essence is existence. It will just necessarily be the case that thing is the cause of everything else that exists. So I think what I'm indicating is I think that the Thomistic approach has some unique advantages to sidestep some other objections or concerns that are launched towards various other forms of cosmological reasoning. The disadvantage to the Thomistic system, I think the most obvious one, is that it assumes a pretty significant background metaphysical picture or project research program. And people, I'm split on this because some people might think that's a disadvantage, or it assumes a controversial metaphysics, as if there's any such thing as a non-controversial metaphysics, right? But to me, I find Aquinas's metaphysical picture very attractive, and it just so happens that if that metaphysical picture is in place, it sort of just leads almost ineluctably to the existence of God. But anyways, people might see that as a disadvantage because they think, well, all of his arguments sort of depend on a prior metaphysical backdrop. So yeah, that's what that is. And you can give me your thoughts in the comments. Do you think that's a major disadvantage that Aquinas is, maybe Aquinas's approaches can be adopted to run on some more neutral metaphysical assumptions? You can let me know what you think about that. All right, Aristotle's approach. All right, so a lot of people think Aristotle's unmoved mover and Aquinas' first way are the same. I don't think so. I think they are different arguments. But real quick, Aristotle starts from looking at changing entities. He's trying to make sense of change. What is change? He thinks that it's undeniable that change occurs. And of course, Aristotle tries to solve some famous puzzles by saying we can make sense of change by really acknowledging a twofold division of being, or modes of being. Aristotle's a modes of being guy. He thinks there's actual being and there's potential being, and that change is something like the actualization of potential, right? So I'm sitting right now, I have the potential to stand, and when I go from potentially standing to actually standing, that's what change is, right? So we make change, sense of change, by not thinking that change is something coming from nothing, but change is the actualization of a potential. Now, Aristotle is going to think that for change to occur, you need a certain causal principle. It's a modest principle of proportionate causality, that only something actual can make something actual. Something that's merely potential or nothing cannot make something actual. So to rise something from potency to act, you need something actual to do that. So anything, for Aristotle, anything that is changed by another. And then ultimately, for the Aristotelian, you're going to think that to make sense of why there's any change at all whatsoever, you need to get back to something that is an unchanged changer or an unmoved mover, right? Very interesting argument. Again, I think it's different than Aquinas's first way. I think Aristotle's is an argument in physics or philosophy of nature. I think Aquinas's is a metaphysical argument. Those are some more technical distinctions that people who are interested in the deeper debates can get into. And so generally it's thought that the unmoved mover, right? Many Aristotelians will argue that that's going to be God, this atemporal agent that just really that accounts for any of the change, ultimately, that we experience. And it's an atemporal entity, because for Aristotle, time itself is just a measure of change, right? So time sort of piggybacks on change. Change is the more fundamental thing, Aristotle, right? So if something is an unchanged changer, it's not going to be something that's in time, because time is the measure of change, right? Okay, so advantages of the Aristotelian approach. Well, it starts from a very common feature of experience. Oftentimes, it's seen as a strength of an argument if you can launch from what seems to be a very secure starting point. It seems quite obvious that change occurs, that this is something that we need to make sense of, that we need to give an account of. Of course, there are philosophers that deny that, and that's in part Aristotle's project is responding to people who are trying to deny the reality of change. But I think most people are willing to say, yeah, this seems like something we need to be able to make sense of, and perhaps Aristotle gives a good analysis of how to make sense of that. And if you think that's right, then that's going to kind of set you up for this type of argument, right? So it seems to have a pretty strong, secure starting point. However, there's been objections, as always. And one is that, hey, look, just because you need something as a sort of primary cause, in one sense, doesn't mean it's a primary cause in all senses. So maybe this unmoved mover is a primary, is just a relative first cause. It's a first cause that makes sense of why things are changing or moving. But who's to say that this is the first cause in the most robust, the most robust sense, if you will, a primary cause of the existence of everything else apart from itself? So that's a challenge that people have posed. And of course, there are responses to that, but I'll leave that challenge for you to think about. Does getting to this unmoved mover or unchanged changer, I don't want to say unactualized actualizer, because that's, I think, blending a little bit too much of Thomas's way into it. Do you think just getting to an unmoved mover is enough to claim that this thing is a primary cause, full stop, such that you could fairly designate it as God? Think about that, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. All right, the Neoplatonic approach. This, of course, is an argument from composition, and it's just going to argue that, hey, anything that is composite has a cause. We're not just talking about physical composites, but metaphysical composites. And so to get a full, adequate explanation of why there are any composite things at all, we need to get to something that is absolutely simple. And then there'll be arguments for why something that is absolutely simple is not susceptible to duplication or multiplication. Neil Gerson has a pretty nice development of this in his book on Plotinus, if people want a kind of contemporary. This is probably the one approach that I have not had a conversation on in this podcast yet. I'm pretty sure. So by the way, the Aristotelian approach, Rob Coons has been on my show to defend that as well. The Thomistic approach, we talked about that. I don't think I've ever done one on the Neoplatonic approach. Maybe, so I might not have a place on this podcast to point you towards, but you can check out Lloyd Gerson and his book Plotinus. I think is it's a great book in general, but at the beginning of the book, he develops this argument for the fundamental absolutely first simple principle. So I'll just go right to the disadvantages with this. I mean, I guess an advantage is, it seems pretty intuitive. The composite things have a cause. It seems like wholes stand in potency in relation to their parts existing and coming together in the right way. It seems, I guess, pretty intuitive. But the disadvantage is people challenge that intuition, right? Well, maybe the whole is ontologically prior to the parts, right? Maybe the whole can be the cause of its parts. What do you say to that, Mr. Defender of the Neoplatonic approach? So I will just leave that there for you, and maybe you guys have some thoughts on that. And if you're an advocate of this approach, how would you respond to that? You let me know in the comments. Yeah, people are like, well, look at an animal. Doesn't an animal cause its parts? If so, then maybe this whole approach is just totally misguided or something like that. Another thing I'll say about potential disadvantages of the Neoplatonic approach, the Thomistic approach, and whatever, and this is something other people have brought up, is, do they all assume PSR? Or at least some version of PSR, right? So even though they're kind of operating from their own respective causal principles, is it the case that they're just sort of assuming that there are no brute facts, right? That it's just not a brute fact that something whose essence doesn't guarantee its existence just happens to have existence, or it's just a brute fact that this composite entity, its parts just are there and are arranged in such a way that even though it makes sense to ask how and why, there's just no answer to it, right? And many people have posed that challenge. They said, look, at the end of the day, a lot of these approaches sort of assume the PSR. They're kind of they kind of depend in a sense on the Leibnizian approach. They might offer somewhat privileged paths and ways of maybe thinking, getting to the existence of God and thinking about God's nature in unique ways, but they all kind of have to have PSR in the back pocket, if you will. Now, there's people who deny that, and they say, no, these approaches do not assume PSR, but that might be a potential disadvantage, and it's been a challenge that has been raised. So you guys can let me know your thoughts on that. Now, I think it's obvious that some of these approaches don't. I mean, Anselm's approach clearly does not require PSR. And the next one actually does not require PSR, and this is Barry Miller's approach. Okay, so Miller's approach, Barry Miller, good old Barry Miller, his approach definitely does not depend on PSR. And the reason being is that Miller's approach argues that contingent entities, like Thumper the rabbit, let's just say that Thumper is not a fictional entity, but a pet rabbit of our acquaintance. Miller's going to argue that these are contradictory structures when they're considered just in and of themselves. And the contradiction that Miller's trying to pull out is that Thumper the rabbit must be composed of certain metaphysical parts, yet cannot be composed of certain metaphysical parts if Thumper is all there is to the story. So Miller goes on to argue, and Miller's approach is very technical, very complex, and in many ways very brilliant, but he goes on to argue that to resolve this paradox, which you have to, right? This can't be a real contradiction because Thumper exists, so he can't be a contradictory structure, right? But he says the only way to resolve this paradox is to admit that Thumper exists must be a suppressed or shorthand proposition, for Thumper exists qua dependent upon some extrinsic cause, right? And that's what leads Miller to really issue the greatest sentence of all time, namely that there can be no non-contradictory, non-elliptical construal of atomic sentences of the form A exists. Put that on a t-shirt and let's sell it here on Philosophy for the People. So what's the advantage of Miller's approach? Well, the advantage is that it requires no upfront causal explanatory principle, right? He's just running from the principle of contradiction here. So no PSR required at all. The disadvantage of Miller's approach, specifically the primary disadvantage, I think, of Miller's approach is that Miller proceeds his launches his analysis, I should say, from the position that language mirrors ontology, and that more specifically that a logical analysis of language reveals ontological categories. Now, Miller defends that. He defends that position But if somebody were to really go after Miller, which certain critics have, that's probably the place they would try to attack him at. So that is, I would say, the disadvantage of Miller's approach. And you guys can let me know whether you think that is a serious disadvantage or not. I think kind of again, if you go with Miller on that approach, his argument actually follows along quite strongly and pretty quickly. But that to me seems to be the primary disadvantage of it. Okay, moving on now to the Kalam cosmological argument. As often, probably the most prominent defender today is William Lane Craig. But of course, it's been also argued for by people like Alex Proust and Rob Koons. Koons and Proust are kind of more interested in establishing the wider thesis of causal finitism, which applies to this argument. But definitely, William Lane Craig has been the primary champion of this argument in recent years. So let me get it up on screen and we'll talk about what it is. And the Kalam argument just, starts with the claim that nothing begins to exist without a cause and that the universe began to exist. So the advantage is a very simple argument to just get across a conversation. Because if the universe began to exist, and if we just take the universe as just all physical reality, all of space-time reality, then it seems to produce a conclusion of some transcendent cause of the universe, which again, people have to go on to argue actually is God, has the divine attributes, which they do. So that's the advantage. I mean, it's just a very simple argument to get across. Sometimes people think it's so simple that there's kind of deceptive or something or tricky. But of course, it's an argument that is very seriously promoted and very seriously argued for. The disadvantage is again contending with infinite regress issues. That's why the thesis of causal finitism is really interesting and has gotten a lot of attention. So people might want to look there. And of course, adjudicating the scientific evidence. Oftentimes, proponents of the Kalam argument will try to push through the premise that the universe began to exist by pointing to contemporary science. And that is a very messy affair. And it's of course, it's questionable and has been questioned whether that is going to actually allow you to push through that premise or not. All right, so people can think about that, and you can. So it's kind of interesting, I've seen proponents of the Kalam kind of vary on this. Some will say, "Well, I really just prefer or just use the philosophical considerations for the beginning of all physical reality." Other people will say, "I'm not convinced of the philosophical arguments against an infinite past. So I use just the science, right?" And it's interesting to see how people are just split on that. That's merely an observation. All right, the Swinburnian approach from Richard Swinburne. Okay, sorry, I'm just going to zoom out so we can get a better look at this here. All right, so Swinburne's approach is this. It's very interesting. So rather than, trying to run a deductive argument for God, Swinburne is kind of reasoning about God in a very scientific manner, if you will. He's kind of constructing a worldview hypothesis, a big picture view of reality. And he's going to argue that God explains the relevant data, the sort of data that a worldview should be able to explain, better than the naturalistic hypothesis, and is a simpler hypothesis than its rival. Its rivals, I think Swinburne would argue. Obviously, theism and naturalism don't form a partition, right? There's other options on the table. Okay, so this is more, this is Swinburne's, he's really he's doing an inductive approach ultimately. And so what's the advantage of this? Well, it's in a sense, it's more modest and it's quite similar to scientific reasoning, right? You kind of look at various theoretical virtues, the two big ones being explanatory comprehensiveness, and then for Swinburne, simplicity, right? And that argue that theism is just ultimately the better hypothesis. The disadvantages are that it doesn't offer proof. It's again, it's something that's tries to argue for a certain degree of credence in the hypothesis, right? Whatever that is. And you also have to argue for Swinburne, especially, a lot of it comes down to simplicity. So you do have to try and make the case that God is a simpler hypothesis in the relevant respects. And that's a very messy debate. Debates, there's a lot of controversy concerning simplicity. Some people think simplicity isn't even all that important, even in scientific theories, and they'll argue that it's even less important or relevant when it comes to philosophical theorizing. In fact, Michael Huemer just finished his book, Understanding Knowledge, is pretty critical of these simplicity type considerations. Obviously, a lot of people don't agree with Huemer on that, and they think simplicity is a really important consideration. But it's a debate of how, like that itself is a debate. And then it's a debate of, well, what form of simplicity matters most, right? And there's different ways of thinking about simplicity. Is it just simplicity on the fundamental level? Is it syntactical simplicity? Is it ontological simplicity, right? It's a complicated debate. So that is a disadvantage, trying to wade through all that. But here's the deal at the end of the day, guys. No matter what approach you take, philosophy is always hard. It's always difficult. There's no easy method here. No matter what approach you're going to take, you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and do hard work at some point. And that's just the name of the philosophical game, my friends. So yeah. All right, so let's finish with this one. And this is the Plantingian approach. And this is like the no argument approach, right? So if you remember our discussion of Plantinga back with the problem of evil, the idea for Plantinga is, look, belief in God can be well justified, perfectly reasonable, apart from any arguments whatsoever. Why is that? Well, it seems like belief in God is sort of a belief that's just sort of naturally occasioned in us, like many of our other beliefs, like that there's a world outside of my mind, that other people are minded like I am, and so on and so forth. And these are non-inferential beliefs, and they're well justified because of Plantinga's externalist theory of knowledge, which is proper functionalism. So the advantage of Plantinga's approach is that, hey, you might be able to be perfectly reasonable and well justified believing in God, even if you don't have any arguments whatsoever, right? And people think that's pretty nifty, at least if you do believe in God. There's definitely advantages to that. The disadvantage is that it depends on, Plantinga's externalist theory of knowledge, right? Is sort of proper functionalist account. And of course, there's tons of debate about that. So there you have it, my friends. That is an overview of just many different approaches to God. Not all of them. There's some in here that we've left out. We left out SCOTUS. I'll just say, go check out my SCOTUS's very interesting modal argument. Go check out my recent conversation with Dr. Tom Ward to dive into that deeper. The Plantinga's approach, you can check out my conversations with Dr. Tyler McNabb. Let me just give that summary. Swinburne's approach, check out my conversations with Dr. Sijuwadi. The Kalam approach, check out my conversations with Dr. Rob Coons. Miller's approach, check out my conversations with myself. I'll be doing more on Miller's approach later on, because it's actually one of the approaches I develop in my upcoming book with Sophia. I love Barry Miller. I think he's a genius. The Neoplatonic approach, I don't think I have one on that. It's the one I'm just going to have to point out to a particular volume, Lloyd Gerson. The Aristotelian approach, again, see my conversations with Rob Coons. Thomistic approach, a million conversations with Dr. Gavin Kerr. Anselmian approach, Dr. Daniel Vecchio. And the Leibnizian approach, again, I've covered with Dr. Rob Coons. We've really gotten our mileage out of Dr. Rob Coons on this show, and Joshua Rasmussen. So Rasmussen, I would broadly lump under Rasmussen's approach under the Leibnizian approach. He's got an argument from limits, but of course he does develop, a pretty standard Leibnizian cosmological argument in various places as well. So Rasmussen I would put under there. So I would check out my chats with a good friend, Joshua Rasmussen, who's going to be coming back on the show again soon. So let me know, guys. Please comment. Let me know of any approaches that I missed that you like, that you think we should give some more attention to. And I've outlined some. Let me know what your favorite approach is, and I've outlined some challenges here. And if you guys have any thoughts on any of those challenges to any of these approaches, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on that as well. Thanks for supporting the show. Please like, please comment, please share, please subscribe. We'll catch you guys next time.